My name is Megan Hartley. I was 31 years old the morning my mother carried her 2 suitcases through the front door of the house she said would never exist. She didn't speak for a long time when she first walked in. That surprised me. My mother always had something to say. She touched the edge of the kitchen counter, white marble, long enough that 3 people could prep a meal on it without touching elbows. She looked up at the ceiling. 12 feet. She looked at the windows, floor to ceiling, facing the backyard. 2 acres. She looked at the staircase. She looked at the island with the built-in wine rack that James had picked out himself. And then she found something. "It's quite a home," she said. "James must have taken on considerable debt." I didn't answer her. I walked to the counter and I opened the folder that had been sitting there since 6 that morning. I slid it toward her. I watched her hands go still as she read the first page. My mother didn't say anything for almost 4 minutes. And when she finally looked up at me, I reached into the kitchen drawer and set something on the counter between us. A key. Brass. Monogrammed. "James had that made for you," I said. She picked it up. She didn't speak. She didn't have to. But here's what my mother didn't know when she looked at that key. When she looked at that folder. When she first walked through that door. She didn't know what I'd been keeping, and for how long. She didn't know the file that folder had started with. And she didn't know that the first entry in that file was a journal page dated 7 years ago, from the night she took me into her kitchen and told me I had married down. Welcome to Betrayal House. I'm glad you're here. If you're new to this channel, this is where we tell the stories that families don't talk about at the dinner table. The quiet betrayals, the slow burns, the moments where patience turns out to be the most powerful weapon in the room. Before I take you back to the beginning, I just want to say 2 things. First, if this story resonates with you today, hit that subscribe button. I put out new stories every week, and the comment section on every single video is full of people who have been through something eerily similar. You'll want to be there for that. Second, drop your location and the time where you're watching this. Charlotte, North Carolina. Tuesday morning. That's me, right now, standing in my own kitchen, telling you this story for the very first time. All right, let's go back. Let me take you back to Charlotte, to a house that was nothing like this one, to a Sunday dinner that I have replayed in my head more times than I can count. But first, I need to start even earlier than that. Let me take you back to the kind of house where everything had a right way and a wrong way. The right way to set a table. The right kind of neighborhood. The right kind of man to bring home. The right kind of future to be building at 23, at 25, at 28. My mother didn't think of herself as controlling. She thought of herself as someone who paid attention, someone who had learned, through experience, that the world rewarded certain choices and punished others, and who was simply trying to pass that knowledge on. That's how she would describe it if you asked her. I would describe it differently. I would describe Sunday afternoons in the living room, where the furniture was arranged the same way it had been for 20 years, and no one moved anything because that would prompt a conversation about why you moved it. I would describe the way my mother kept a mental ledger of every family in the neighborhood, who had upgraded their car, who had taken their kids to which school, who was managing and who was slipping. Not cruel gossip, just data, filed and cross-referenced, always available. I would describe the way she looked at other people's children, with a specific measuring kind of attention, as if she were running a quiet calculation. What they had achieved, what they hadn't, and whether their parents had anything to do with either outcome. I was aware, from very young, that I was always somewhere in that calculation. But let me start at the beginning. Her beginning, really, because you can't understand what she said to me in that kitchen without understanding who she was before I was ever born. My mother, Diane Caldwell, grew up in a family that had what she called a good name. Not wealthy, not well connected in any political or business sense, but respectable. Her father had been an insurance broker, the kind who had an actual office with his name on the door, not just a desk at a franchise. Her mother had been a homemaker who kept the house immaculate and volunteered at the church, and whose opinion of other people's choices was offered freely and frequently. Diane absorbed all of it. She married my father, Gerald Hartley, when she was 24. He was an accountant, stable, dependable, quiet in the specific way that suited her. He had opinions of his own, but rarely felt the need to defend them against hers. They moved to Charlotte when I was 2. Good neighborhood, good school district, right choices, all the way down. I was their only child. Which meant that I was, without ever being told this directly, the single most important project my mother had ever taken on. It wasn't unkind, exactly. She wasn't cruel. She came to every school play. She helped me with college applications. She asked about my friends and remembered their names and their parents' professions, which she filed away with a precision I only understood later. But underneath every interaction was a current I could feel from the time I was maybe 7 or 8 years old. I remember my mother saying, when I was about 12, after I had tried out for the school play and didn't get the part I wanted, "This is why we don't chase things we're not already positioned to win, Megan. You have to know what category you're in before you compete." I was 12. I wrote that one down too, eventually. The undertone of everything she said to me, from as early as I can remember, was this: "You represent us. Make the right choices. Don't embarrass me." The right choices, as she defined them, involved a very specific kind of man. My mother had a nephew, my cousin Marcus, my Aunt Sandra's son, who had gone to Duke for undergrad and then to law school in D.C. He was 2 years older than me. He was articulate and well-dressed, and had a career trajectory that my mother described, with barely concealed reverence, as going somewhere. Starting when I was about 19, Marcus started showing up at every Hartley family dinner. Not every family dinner, just the ones my mother organized. I noticed the pattern around the 3rd or 4th time. The way she'd seat us next to each other. The way she'd steer conversation toward his accomplishments. A case he'd won. A firm he'd been approached by. A conference he'd attended in London. The way she'd look at me after he said something impressive, as if I were supposed to be taking notes. Marcus was perfectly nice. That wasn't the point. The point was that my mother had already written the next chapter of my life, and she was very patiently waiting for me to figure out that I was supposed to live it. I didn't tell her for a long time that I wasn't planning to. I'm a teacher. I have been since I was 22, when I started at an elementary school in East Charlotte, and discovered, to my own surprise, that I was genuinely good at it. Not just good at explaining things, good at watching people, good at noticing when something wasn't adding up, good at keeping track. That last part was important. I started keeping a journal in college. Nothing dramatic, just dates and notes. I dated every entry. I wrote down what people said, sometimes verbatim, if it struck me as significant. I wrote down things that happened, in order, with context. My college roommate used to joke that I was building a case file for my own life. She wasn't entirely wrong. At school, I became the teacher who kept her records organized to a degree that made the administration slightly nervous. Parent communication logs, incident reports with timestamps, documentation of accommodations and follow-ups and everything that had been promised and whether it had been delivered. Not because I was paranoid, because I had learned, early, that the version of events people remembered tended to match what they wanted to have happened, and the only way to have the actual version available was to have written it down at the time. My mother, for her part, kept records of a different kind. She kept track of other people's failures. She had a story for every cautionary tale. The neighbor's daughter who had married a musician and was now living in a 2-bedroom apartment in her 40s. The coworker who had passed up a solid man for someone exciting and had spent a decade regretting it. She told these stories not as gossip, but as data. Evidence for the thesis she had been building her whole adult life. The right choices now protect you later. And the wrong choices. The impractical ones. The passionate ones. The ones that looked good on a Tuesday but not on a rainy Wednesday when you were 47. Those came for you eventually. She wasn't wrong that choices had consequences. She was wrong about which ones were the right ones. I remember one specific afternoon when I was about 10 years old. It was summer. I had spent the day at a friend's house, a girl named Becca whose family had a pool and a dog, and a house that was slightly smaller than ours, and slightly louder and considerably happier. I came home sunburned and tired and happy, and my mother looked at me from the kitchen doorway and said, "I hope you weren't running around all day. You need to present yourself better than that." I was 10. I was sunburned. I had been a child. I remember standing in the hallway looking at her and thinking something I didn't yet have words for. Something about the difference between the way she saw me and the way I actually was. The distance between those two things. I started keeping a journal 3 years later, but she hadn't met James yet, and I hadn't figured out yet just how badly her framework was going to collide with what I was quietly building. The symbolic moment, the one I go back to now, happened at Easter dinner when I was 26. Marcus was there, as usual. He'd just been made junior partner at his firm. My mother announced it at the table before he even sat down, as if it were news about our family. She looked at me when she said it. I smiled and passed the rolls. I drove home that night and opened my journal. I wrote the date. I wrote, "She still thinks this is going somewhere." It isn't. But I'm not going to say that yet. I closed the journal and went to bed. I lay there for a while in the dark, thinking about what it means to be someone's project, to be the living evidence of your parents' choices, their instincts, their whole theory of what a good life looks like. I understood, in a way I hadn't quite articulated before, that my mother wasn't pushing Marcus because she thought Marcus was exceptional. She was pushing him because he was comprehensible. She could measure him. She could explain him to people at dinner parties. She could point to his trajectory the way you point to a road on a map and say, "Here, this is where we are. This is where we're going." James would not be comprehensible to her. Not at first. Maybe not for a long time. I thought about that. And then I thought about the journal on my nightstand. The specific weight of it. All those dated entries. All those things I had written down because I hadn't trusted them to memory alone. I didn't know then what I was getting ready for. But I was getting ready. I met James Okafor on a Tuesday in October. He came to fix the school's HVAC system. The main unit had gone out overnight, and we were running space heaters in every classroom, which the kids thought was an adventure, and the staff did not. He arrived at 7:15 in the morning, before most of the teachers had even gotten in. I was already there because I'm always already there. I had a cup of coffee and a lesson plan I was annotating, and a stack of parent emails I hadn't answered yet. He knocked on my classroom door to let me know he'd need to access the vent panel inside, which was above the reading corner. I said that was fine. He said it would take about 20 minutes. I said I'd be at my desk. He worked quietly. He didn't make small talk. He moved with a kind of careful efficiency that I noticed the way you notice something that is the opposite of what you're used to. Because I am surrounded, all day, by small people who are loud and urgent, and haven't yet learned that most things can wait until you're ready. 20 minutes became 40, because the problem turned out to be more complicated than expected. He explained what was actually wrong, a cracked component in the secondary system, not just the primary, in plain, clear language, without condescension and without unnecessary jargon. He said he'd have to come back with a part. He came back the next day. We talked in the parking lot for 11 minutes. I know it was 11 minutes because I checked the time when I realized I was still standing there. His name was James Okafor, 34 years old. He'd grown up in Charlotte. He'd worked for someone else's HVAC company for 6 years, then borrowed $6,000 from his uncle and started his own at 27. He had 5 employees. He was trying to get to 8 by the following spring. He said this plainly, without apology and without performance. I appreciated that. I did not tell my mother about him for 8 months. This was a decision I made consciously and early. In those 8 months, James and I went to dinner at a Thai place near his office on our 3rd date and talked for 4 hours. We walked along the Greenway on a Saturday morning, and he told me about his uncle, the one who had lent him the money, and what that had meant to him, not just financially, but as a statement of belief from a person he respected. He said, "I wanted to pay him back fast, not because he needed it, because I needed him to know I took it seriously." I wrote that down when I got home. Not because I thought it was evidence of anything, just because it struck me as true in a way I wanted to keep. We were 6 weeks in when he met 2 of my friends, and he remembered their names the next time he heard me mention them. We were 4 months in when his water heater broke at 11 on a Wednesday night, and instead of panicking, he put a bucket under it, called his supplier, and had a new unit installed by 8 the next morning. We were 7 months in when he told me he'd been offered a partnership at a larger firm, and turned it down because he wasn't willing to give up what he'd built for the promise of something that someone else controlled. I respected that decision in a way I found hard to explain. My mother would have called it foolish, too proud, not practical. She would have been looking at the wrong thing. I wanted to know what this was, what we were, before I had to defend it. Because I knew, without anyone having to explain it to me, that James Okafor was not what my mother had in mind. His hands were calloused. He drove a work truck. He did not have a law degree or a firm or a trajectory my mother could describe at dinner with barely concealed reverence. He had something she had never valued. He built things. And in those 8 months, I started building something too. I had always wanted to get my real estate license. I'd looked at the course requirements twice before, and talked myself out of it both times. Too busy, not the right moment. I'd do it next year. But James had been talking about property investment in a way that made me actually want to understand it, not just listen to it, and I signed up for the night course in January. 6 months later, I had my license. I didn't use it right away. I wasn't leaving teaching. But I understood now. Paperwork, title searches, deed structures, LLC protection for property assets. LLC stands for Limited Liability Company, which is a legal structure that separates a business's debts and obligations from the personal finances of its owners, meaning that if something goes wrong in the business, your personal savings and home can't be touched. I could read a contract and know what I was reading. James thought this was remarkable. I told him I was a teacher. We document things. He laughed. He had the kind of laugh that came from somewhere real, not from social obligation. I dated the first entry about him in my journal. The Tuesday in October, parking lot, 11 minutes. I noted what he said about the company, the number of employees, the spring target. I noted the $6,000 loan from his uncle. I don't fully know why I documented it that way. It was a habit. It's what I did. But I think even then, some part of me understood that this was a story that was going to need a record, because the people in my life who were going to have the most to say about James Okafor had not yet met him. And when they did, I wanted to have been paying attention from the beginning. We moved in together when I was 28. A 2-bedroom house in a neighborhood that was not what my mother would have chosen, but that was ours. Bought, not rented, with a down payment we had each contributed to from savings we had each been building since before we met each other. My mother came to see it once. She said the kitchen was small. I said we liked it. She said the neighborhood was up and coming, which is what she said when she meant it wasn't there yet. I said we thought it had good bones. She left after 45 minutes and called me from her car. "I just want you to be careful," she said. I asked what that meant. She said she was just saying. She said, "Men like James, Megan, they work hard, I'm sure of that. But there's a ceiling. You understand what I mean. There's only so far that kind of work takes you. And you're 31, 28. And this is the time when the decisions you make determine everything." I said, "I understand, Mom." She said, "I just want you to have options." I said, "I do have options. I chose this one." Silence. "Okay," she said. "Okay." I hung up and wrote down the date, the duration of her visit, and the exact phrase she had used. "I just want you to be careful." I wrote down the ceiling comment, verbatim, in quotation marks. I didn't know what I was going to do with that. I just wrote it down. James's company had grown to 9 employees by then. He had just signed his first contract with a mid-sized office building, a 2-year maintenance agreement, which is the kind of contract that locks in consistent monthly revenue instead of depending on individual service calls. He had moved out of the work truck and into a small office space, and he had hired his first office manager. I watched him build. And I noticed something. He talked about his business the way I talked about my classroom, not with ego, with attention. With the specific care of someone who understood that the details were not separate from the point. They were the point. My mother called every Sunday. She never asked about the company. She asked if James was keeping busy. She asked if we were managing. She asked once whether he had looked into getting additional certifications, as if he were still at the beginning of something, as if the something he was already deep inside weren't visible to her. I said he was doing well. She said that was good. That was good. I could feel it in her voice. The patience of someone who believed they were going to be right eventually, and was simply waiting. What she didn't know, what she couldn't see, because she had decided what James was before she ever really looked, was that the company was accelerating, that the office building contract had led to 2 referrals, that James had been in conversations with a regional commercial real estate firm about taking on a larger portfolio of properties, that something was coming. I felt it. Not as anxiety, as something quieter, the feeling of a structure being built correctly, load-bearing walls going in first, no shortcuts taken, no debt incurred without a plan to service it, the feeling of being ready for something you can't fully see yet. And then one night, James came home from a meeting and put his laptop on the kitchen table and showed me a proposal. A hospital network. Regional. 3 facilities. I read the number on the contract. $2.3 million. 3 years. I looked at him. He said, "I think we're going to get it." We did. We announced the engagement at a Sunday dinner at my parents' house. I had picked a Sunday because my mother was always in a better mood when she'd had the morning to herself. I'd planned what I was going to say. I had thought about the order of things. Tell them both together. Give my father a moment to react first. Let my mother's reaction follow instead of lead. I had even thought about where to sit. What I had not thought about, and should have, was that no amount of planning can account for someone who has already decided. We sat down. My father poured wine. James was good in that room. Steady, warm, not performing. He had worn a dark green button-down shirt that I had seen him iron himself that morning, which he did with the same methodical attention he brought to everything. He didn't dress up to impress anyone. He dressed because he respected where he was going. He asked my father about his golf game, and my father answered with the specific enthusiasm of a man who doesn't get to talk about golf enough. My mother watched from her end of the table with an expression I had learned to read. Pleasant surface. Active assessment underneath. She had made pot roast. The smell of it had hit us at the front door. Bay leaf, rosemary, the particular richness of something that had been cooking since noon. She always cooked well when she was preparing for a conversation. I waited until the main course was almost done. I said we had news. James put his hand on the table. Not on mine, just near it. Present. I said we were engaged. My father said, "Oh, wonderful," immediately, and looked like he meant it. He stood up and came around the table and shook James's hand and hugged me, which was more physical warmth than I had seen from him in years, and I understood that he had been waiting a long time to be in a moment that felt uncomplicated. My mother said, "That's wonderful news." She smiled. She asked to see the ring. She said the setting was lovely. She poured herself a bit more wine. And then, a few minutes later, she asked me to come help her with the dessert. The kitchen was 15 feet away. We had not been preparing dessert. It was a carton of ice cream in the freezer. I followed her. She turned on the tap, not to wash anything, just to create the sound of water. And she turned to face me. "Megan, Mom, I need you to hear me." I waited. "You have married down," she said. "I want you to know that I know that. And I believe that you know that too. Even if you won't say it. A repairman, Megan. After everything you have available to you. You chose a repairman." I didn't say anything. "When you come crawling back," she said, "don't expect me to say I told you so. Because I will. I want you to know that right now, so there are no surprises later." She turned off the tap. She got 3 bowls out of the cabinet. The clink of ceramic against the counter. the quiet scrape of the spoon against the carton. She scooped ice cream into them as if the conversation had not happened. I stood there for a moment in that kitchen. I looked at the back of her head, at the careful set of her shoulders, at the way she was already moving on to the next thing, having said the thing she needed to say, having placed it on record in the way she understood records to work, said aloud, between two people, witnessed by no one. She didn't know that I had a different understanding of records. She didn't know about my journal, sitting on the nightstand at home. She didn't know that when I got back to that house tonight, I was going to open it and write every single word she had just said, in the exact order she said it, with the date at the top. She thought the conversation was finished. I thought it was the first entry in a file. Then I walked back to the table and sat down next to James. He looked at me. A quick look, questioning. I shook my head very slightly. Later. He nodded. My mother brought the ice cream. My father talked about the golf game again. We left at 8:15. In the car, James didn't ask me what she'd said. He just drove. The city lights passed over us in sequence. He had the radio on low. Something instrumental. Nothing with words. He drove the way he did everything. Without rushing. Without performing calm. Just actually calm in the way that some people are built. Not because nothing bothered him. Because he had decided, early in his life, that most things could wait to be felt until you were somewhere safe enough to feel them. I watched the road for a while. Then I said, "She told me I married down." He didn't react the way I expected. He didn't get tense. He didn't say anything immediately. He drove for about 30 seconds and then he said, "What did you say back?" I said, "Okay." He nodded. Like that made sense to him. We drove the rest of the way home in the quiet. At home, I sat at the kitchen table and opened my journal to a fresh page. I wrote the date. I wrote the time. I wrote, in quotation marks, exactly what she had said. Every word. In order. And at the bottom of the entry, I wrote 2 more words. Filed. Noted. I closed the journal. I didn't cry. I wasn't angry. I was something else. Something that didn't have a clean name yet but felt, in my chest, like a door closing quietly on its latch. Not a slam. Just a close. 6 weeks after the wedding, James and I sat across a desk from an attorney named Carol Simmons. Carol Simmons was 61 years old, had been practicing family and business law for 33 years, and had the kind of office where nothing was decorative. Every item on the shelves had a function. I liked her immediately. We had not been referred by anyone dramatic. James had found her through the commercial real estate firm he'd recently started working with. They used her for contract review. They said she was thorough. We weren't there because anything was wrong. We were there because James's company was growing faster than we had anticipated, and because I had learned, from 7 years of teaching, from incident reports and parent logs and documented accommodations, that the time to build the structure is before you need it, not after. Carol explained, in plain language, what the options were. She recommended restructuring James's LLC, limited liability company, the legal entity that separates his business finances from our personal ones, to handle the scale the company was approaching. She recommended a joint property trust for any real estate we acquired together. A revocable trust is a legal arrangement where assets are held in the name of the trust, rather than any individual person, which means they exist outside the reach of personal disputes, creditors, and, she said this without drama, family claims. I wrote that down. Family claims. She said the phrase without inflection, as a legal category, not a personal one. She didn't know about my mother. I didn't tell her. But I underlined it. James signed the restructuring documents. We signed the joint trust paperwork together. Carol's paralegal notarized everything. I took copies of every document and drove home and added them to the folder I had been maintaining since the engagement. Dates, records, everything in order. At the back of the folder, behind the legal documents, I put the journal page. The one from the dinner. The one with my mother's words written out verbatim, in quotation marks. I didn't know why I put it there. It was not, technically, a legal document. But it was a record. And I kept records. Carol's last sentence in that meeting was this: "The best case scenario is that you never need any of this. The second best case is that if you do, you have it." I nodded. I thought about my mother in her kitchen, turning on the tap, scooping ice cream into 3 bowls. "When you come crawling back, we'll have it," I said. The hospital contract came through in March. James called me from the parking lot after the meeting, and I could hear in his voice the specific quality of someone who is holding a large thing very carefully because they don't want to drop it. "We got it," he said. $2.3 million. 3 facilities. A 3-year maintenance and emergency service agreement with a regional hospital network that operated out of Charlotte and 2 neighboring cities. I said, "I knew you would." He said, "I need to hire 6 more people." I said, "I know. Do it." He did. By that fall, the company had 18 employees. By the following spring, 22. James moved into a larger office space, not flashy, just functional, the way he liked things. He hired a full-time operations manager. He hired a second project lead. He started taking Saturday mornings to himself, not to rest exactly, but to think, to read contracts, to plan the next 18 months. I watched all of this the way I watch things, from a step back, attentively, with a notebook nearby. We purchased a second property that year, a rental, a 3-bedroom house in a neighborhood that had already come into its own, not one that was still getting there. James had seen it before the market caught up. We put it under the trust. Then a third, a duplex, also under the trust. Both units rented within the first month. I managed the rental side. My real estate license, which I had been holding quietly like a card I wasn't sure when to play, turned out to be exactly the right tool for exactly this moment. I handled the lease agreements, the tenant communications, the documentation. I created a property management system in a shared folder on our home computer, organized by property, by year, by category. I labeled the folder, our records. Inside it, every deed, in full. Every LLC document. Every bank statement for the business and the properties. The hospital contract. All 47 pages scanned. The property trust agreement. The restructuring documents from Carol Simmons's office. And at the back, in its own subfolder, the journal page. One evening, going through old files to reorganize them, I found something I had almost forgotten. A photocopy of the original loan document, the $6,000 loan James had taken from his uncle to start the company. He had paid it back within the first year, and his uncle had given him the repaid amount as a wedding gift, which James had put directly back into the business. I sat with it for a moment at the kitchen table. $6,000. A single page, a date, a signature, and an amount that was, by any measure, an act of faith more than finance. I thought about my mother saying there was a ceiling. I thought about the hospital contract. 47 pages. $2.3 million. I scanned the loan document. I added it to the folder. Not because it was relevant to anything pending, just because it was the beginning, and I wanted us to have the whole story. There is something I want to tell you about what it felt like to build that folder over those years, because I think it matters for understanding what happened later. It didn't feel like preparation for a confrontation. It didn't feel like building a case. It just felt like the natural extension of who I am, a person who has always believed that the truth of something lives in its documentation, and that the documentation is only useful if you kept it from the beginning, not from the moment you realized you might need it. I was a teacher. I kept records because records were what kept me honest with myself. Every time I added something to the folder, a deed, a contract, a bank statement, I was saying, this is real. This happened. These are the facts. And maybe somewhere underneath that, I was also saying, when the time comes, no one will be able to tell me I imagined this. No one will be able to say there's a ceiling, because I will have the documents. A few months later, I want to be precise about the timing because it matters. My mother called on a Sunday, as usual. James had just gotten home from a site visit. I was at the kitchen table with a cup of tea and a stack of tenant renewal letters. My mother asked how I was doing. I said fine. She asked if James was keeping busy. I said he was. She said that was good, that it was nice when people found their groove in whatever they were doing. Whatever they were doing. I looked at the folder on the counter. I thought about the 47 pages of hospital contract. I thought about 22 employees. I thought about 3 properties under a joint trust that was legally untouchable. I said, "He's doing very well, Mom." She said, "Oh, good, good." A pause. "And you're managing? Everything's great," I said. Another pause. "Okay," she said. "That's good to hear." She didn't believe me. I could hear it in her voice. The patient skepticism of someone who had already written the ending and was waiting for the story to catch up. What she didn't know was that the story had already passed her. It had passed her a long time ago. She just hadn't been looking in the right direction. I hung up the phone. I went back to the renewal letters. I dated the notes I was making. And 3 weeks later, James came home and put his laptop on the kitchen table again. He pulled up a listing. 5 bedrooms, 2 acres, just outside Charlotte, a main house, and, on the eastern edge of the property, a separate structure. Smaller, self-contained. A guest house. "Tell me what you think," he said. I read the listing for about 3 minutes. I looked at the photos. I said, "I think it's ours." We put in an offer the next morning. It was accepted in 48 hours. The deed went into the trust. James's name first, then mine, exactly as Carol Simmons had structured it. I printed the deed confirmation and added it to the folder. That night, I made tea and sat at the new kitchen table, a different table than the one we'd had before. Longer, with chairs James had found at an estate sale, and sanded down himself on 3 successive Saturdays. And I looked around the room. The pendant lights James had researched for 3 weekends were on at their lowest setting. The windows were dark. Outside, the 2 acres were quiet and cold. I thought about Becca's pool and the summer I was 10. I thought about standing in a hallway being told I needed to present myself better. I thought about Easter dinner and the rolls going around the table. I thought about the parking lot at school, 11 minutes, the specific planeway James had said. I started my own at 27, and I thought, we're going to be okay. Not just financially, not just legally, but in the larger sense. The way that people are okay when they chose right, and then did the work and didn't stop. I didn't know, that evening, that within 4 months my mother would need somewhere to live. But I think some part of me, the part that dates journal entries and creates subfolders and keeps things just in case, had been building toward this moment without knowing what it was for. Now I know what it was for. I'm going to stop here for just a second, because what happens next is the part I've been sitting with for 7 years, and I want you to be ready for it. But before I get there, I want to ask you something. Has someone in your life ever predicted that you would fail? A parent, a sibling, an ex, someone who watched you make a choice they disapproved of and told you, directly or indirectly, that you were going to regret it? Drop the year in the comments. Just the year. I don't need the whole story. Although if you want to tell it, this is absolutely the place. And if you haven't subscribed yet, please do it now. Tap the button. Turn on notifications. Because the stories I share here are long and specific, and they go places you don't expect. And I don't want you to miss the rest of this one. Because what my mother did next, what she said to me on that Sunday phone call 4 months after we bought the house, and what I had waiting for her when she finally walked through that door, is the part that still makes me need to sit down when I think about it. Okay, let's keep going. My mother called on the 2nd Sunday of November. This was not unusual, but the call was different from the beginning. I could hear it in the first 30 seconds, in the specific way she started with a question about how I was doing, that went on slightly too long, as if she were warming up to something. She and my father had sold their house the previous spring. My father's retirement had not gone the way they had planned. He'd retired at 62 with a financial portfolio that had looked stable and had then, over the following 18 months, not been. Not a catastrophe, not poverty, but a significant recalibration. They had sold the house, paid off what needed to be paid off, and moved into a rental. A rental that was, as of the second Sunday of November, no longer available. The landlord was selling the property. My parents had 60 days. My father had already arranged to stay with his brother in Raleigh. He would be fine. He had made his own quiet plan, without drama, in the way that my father generally operated. My mother did not have a quiet plan. She had me. "I just need somewhere temporary," she said. "Just until I find something. A few months, maybe." I was standing in the kitchen of the new house. I looked out the back window at the 2 acres. At the eastern edge of the property, the guest house roof was visible above the tree line. "I understand," I said. "I know this isn't ideal," she said. "I know you have your own situation there, and I don't want to be a burden." She said this in the voice of someone who did not actually believe she would be a burden, who had never in her life considered herself to be a burden on anyone, because burden was a category that applied to other people. "I'm going to talk to James," I said. "Of course," she said. "Of course, whatever James thinks. I understand that it's his home, too. His home, too." I noticed the phrasing. I filed it. "I'll call you tomorrow," I said. I hung up and sat down at the kitchen table. I thought about 7 years of Sunday phone calls. Is James keeping busy? I'm sure you're managing. Whatever he's doing. I thought about the engagement dinner and the sound of a tap running and 3 bowls of ice cream on the counter. I thought about the folder sitting 6 feet away from me, organized, indexed, complete. I called James. I told him. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "She's your mother. She can come." That was it. No conditions. No grievance inventory. Just, "She's your mother." I said, "I know, but I want to do this right." He said, "Okay. What does that look like?" I thought about Carol Simmons' office, about the word documentation, about the principle I had carried from teaching into every room I had ever inhabited. Build the structure before you need it. "It looks like a guest house agreement," I said. "Standard occupancy terms, drawn up properly, and I want the folder on the counter when she arrives." James was quiet again. "Then, I'll have a key made for her." I asked what he meant. "A proper key," he said, monogrammed, with her name on it. I paused. "Put your name first," I said. He said, "I know." Carol Simmons drafted the guest house occupancy agreement in 4 days. It was 3 pages, not punitive, not hostile. It looked exactly like what it was. A standard short-term occupancy arrangement for a secondary dwelling on a privately held property, structured to be clear, mutual, and terminable by either party with appropriate notice. It covered the term of occupancy, shared utility arrangements, maintenance responsibilities, expectations around the main house and common areas, and the process by which the arrangement could be extended or concluded. Carol's paralegal called to confirm I'd received it. I said yes. She asked if there was anything I wanted to adjust. I said no. I read it twice more that evening. It was exactly right. Not a punishment, not a message, just a document. Clear terms, signed by both parties, attached to a property that was held in trust, in the trust that James had built. The folder was already current. I'd updated it the week before, adding the most recent LLC tax filing and the renewed property insurance documentation. I printed a 1-page summary. Property addresses with ownership structure, LLC revenue and employee count, approximate net asset value, the hospital network contract reference. 1 page, no editorial. Just numbers and dates and names. I put it on top of the other documents and closed the folder. James had the key made at a shop downtown. Brass, traditional cut. The monogram was his idea from the start, and he had been specific about it. A small brass tag, stamped with the initials Joe, James Okafor Hartley, his name, my name, together. He thought it was practical. He wanted her to feel that the key came from both of us. I thought it was more than practical. I thought it was the truest thing in the room. The morning my mother was set to arrive, I woke up at 5:30. Not anxious. Alert. I made coffee. I went through the folder one more time, not because anything needed adjusting, but because the act of reviewing it was the act of being sure. I set it on the kitchen counter, closed but visible. I set the key next to it. Then I sat down with my coffee and my journal. I opened it to the most recent entry, the one from the Sunday phone call, with her words noted, the phrasing about James's home, and I read back several entries, unhurriedly, in sequence. The engagement dinner, the tap running. When you come crawling back. 7 years of Sundays. I wrote a new entry. The date. The time. The weather. Overcast. November. The kind of morning that stays gray until mid-afternoon. I wrote, "She arrives today. The folder is ready. The key is on the counter. James made it." I closed the journal. At 10:15, I heard a car in the driveway. She came in through the front door with 2 suitcases and a tote bag. I had offered to help her carry things from the car. She said she was fine. She walked into the entryway and stopped. The house is not ostentatious. James and I had talked about that when we were making decisions about it. We wanted something that felt like a home, not a statement. But it is large, and it is well built, and the materials are real. The flooring is hardwood, the ceilings are high. The kitchen is the kind of room that takes a moment to absorb if you've never been inside it. My mother took her moment. She set her tote bag down by the door. She walked into the kitchen slowly, the way you walk into a room when you are recalibrating something in your head. She touched the edge of the counter. She looked at the ceiling. She looked at the windows. 12 feet of glass facing the backyard. The 2 acres. The tree line beyond which the guest house roof was visible. She looked at the staircase. She looked at the island. The wine rack James had picked out. The pendant lights he had researched for 3 weekends before he found the ones that were right. She was quiet for a long time. And then she found something to say. "This is quite a home," she said. James must have taken on considerable debt. I didn't look at her when she said it. I walked to the counter and I opened the folder. I slid it toward her. She looked at it without touching it for a moment. Then she picked up the first page. I watched her read. The 1-page summary, property addresses and ownership structure, LLC formation date and employee count, annual revenue range, the hospital network contract, value, term, the name of the client, the net asset value estimate, as calculated by our financial planner the previous spring, numbers and dates and names. Her hands went still. She turned to the next page. The deed to the property, this property, held in the James and Megan Okafor Hartley Revocable Trust. Her name was not on it. No one's name was on it but ours. She read for a long time. She went through the summary page. She went through the deed. She went through the LLC structure document, which Carol's office had formatted so that even a non-attorney could follow the ownership chain. James's company at the top, the property trust below it, every asset named and accounted for, nothing hidden, nothing owed. She turned pages slowly, methodically, the way someone reads when they are not skimming, when they are reading to understand. Somewhere in that silence I became aware of small sounds. The refrigerator's low hum, a car passing on the road outside, the distant sound of a bird from the direction of the guest house. 4 minutes. Maybe a little more. When she finally looked up, she was looking at me differently than she had before. Not with warmth, exactly. With something harder than that. With the specific look of someone who has arrived at a conclusion they do not have language for, yet because the language they've been using for 7 years has just been made unavailable. I spoke first. "James built this," I said. "The man you called a repairman. This is what he built. These are the documents." She didn't say anything. "And I need you to sign this before you move into the guest house." I set the occupancy agreement on top of the open folder. 3 pages. Carol Simmons's firm letterhead at the top. My mother looked at it. I watched her read it, all 3 pages, slowly. I did not rush her. When she finished, she set it down. She picked up the pen I had placed beside the folder without making a point of it. She signed on the line Carol had marked. She set the pen down. She did not speak. I reached into the kitchen drawer, the one to the left of the sink, where we keep the spare keys, the takeout menus, the things that are used regularly and need to be findable, and I took out the brass key. I set it on the counter between us. She looked at it. I said, "James had that made for you." She picked it up. She looked at the monogram. "Joe." She held it for a moment in both hands. I don't know what she was thinking. I know what I was thinking. That we were standing in the same structure, the same scene, as the opening of this story, as the moment I described to you at the very beginning, before I took you back. The marble counter, the folder, the key, the morning light that had by then finally started to come through the windows. My mother held the key. She looked at the monogram again. Joe. She knew whose initials those were. She knew the order they were in. She understood what that meant, not as a statement, not as a message, just as a fact. This was James's house, and he had still had this key made for her, and his name came first because this was his. She looked like she was working something out behind her eyes, some long calculation that she had been running for 7 years, and that had just delivered an answer she hadn't prepared for. I didn't feel triumphant. I want to be honest about that. I had thought sometimes that when this moment came, whenever this moment came, I would feel something sharp and clean and satisfying. I didn't feel that. I felt tired in the way you feel tired after something that has required a very long kind of attention. I felt, underneath that, something quieter and more durable. Peace, maybe. Or just the specific relief of a structure that has held. My mother held the key. She didn't say anything. And for the first time in 7 years, maybe for the first time in my life, she didn't have to. Neither did I. Here is what happened after that. My mother moved into the guest house the following week. She has been there for 7 months now. She comes to the main house for dinner on Sundays, which is, I'm aware of the symmetry, exactly when she used to call me to check whether I was managing. The calls still happen sometimes, but the tone has shifted. She doesn't ask if James is keeping busy anymore. She asks about the company. She asks which city they're expanding into next. She asked James once, at a Sunday dinner, how he'd decided which commercial contracts to pursue and which to pass on. And he answered for 20 minutes, and she listened without interrupting. I watched her face while he talked. I watched her registering the specificity of it, the way he explained the factors he weighed, the margins, the risk calculus, the relationships he had built with his operations manager. She was nodding. Not politely. Actually nodding. The way you nod when you are tracking someone's logic and finding it coherent. She looked in that moment, like she was meeting him for the first time. Which, in the way that actually matters, she was. I wrote it in my journal. The date. The duration. She listened. James's company now employs 22 people. The expansion into a third state is underway. They've been in conversations with a national facilities management firm about a partnership that I am not going to describe in detail because the paperwork hasn't been finalized, but which, if it goes the way we think it might, will put us in a category my mother doesn't have a word for. The 3 properties under the trust are all occupied. We're looking at a 4th. My father in Raleigh calls every few weeks. He is playing golf again. He sounds like himself. He asked James, the last time we visited, if he'd ever thought about expanding into maintenance contracts for residential communities. James said he'd thought about it. My father said he had a few ideas. They talked for 2 hours. I stayed out of it. I was happy to stay out of it. As for me, I still teach. I still arrive before everyone else and leave after the dismissal bell. I still date every journal entry and keep every record and file, every document in the folder that now takes up 2 drawers instead of 1. I have the original $6,000 loan document in there still, scanned and indexed, the beginning of the story. I have the journal page from the engagement dinner in there too, the one with my mother's words, in quotation marks, verbatim. And I have a new page now, dated the morning she arrived, with a single note at the bottom. She signed. Here is what I know now that I didn't fully understand 7 years ago, standing in my mother's kitchen while the tap ran and the ice cream sat in its carton on the counter. I know that the people who predict your failure are almost never predicting yours. They are predicting their own fear, their own narrow map of what is possible, their own inability to look at something that doesn't fit their framework and recognize it for what it is. My mother saw James Okafor, and she saw a work truck and calloused hands and a job that required him to show up at 7:15 in the morning at an elementary school. And those things were real. Those things were true. But they were also the visible surface of something she had already decided not to look below. What she didn't see, what she couldn't see, because she had chosen her conclusion before she started reading, was a man who built things carefully, who borrowed $6,000 and turned it into a company that employs 22 people, who picked out pendant lights for a kitchen over 3 weekends because he wanted to get it right, who, when I told him his mother-in-law needed somewhere to live, said, "She's your mother. She can come," and who had a key made for her before she arrived, with his name on it first. That's who she called a repairman. I never argued with my mother about it. I never raised my voice. I never delivered a speech. I kept records and I kept building, and I waited for the story to catch up to the documentation. It did. The people who predict your failure are usually predicting their own. You don't have to prove them wrong loudly. You just have to outlast them. And if someone someday hands you a brass key with their name on the monogram to the guest house on the property they built from a $6,000 loan, I hope you know what that key means. I hope you understand what it means that they thought to make it. If any of this felt familiar, if someone told you that you'd fail, that you chose wrong, that you'd come crawling back and they'd be waiting, I want to hear your story. Leave it in the comments. I read every single one. Thank you for spending this time with me. If this story moved you, if it felt true to something you've lived through or watched someone else live through, share it. Put it somewhere someone who needs it will find it. Subscribe to Betrayal House if you haven't already. I'm here every week with a new story, and I promise you, none of them are quiet. And in the comments, tell me your year. The year someone underestimated you. The year you started building anyway. I'll see you in the next one.